Good morning. We're going to begin with welcoming remarks, and then Dr. Hatam will be here for 9:15 or so, and we'll proceed on to His Excellency Ibrahim Rasool. So I'm Tim Shaw, and I'm very pleased to be back in Qatar for my second visit, and delighted to be part of this very interesting, timely network on the diversification of development both in Qatar and in Africa. So it's a great pleasure for me to welcome everybody, to thank you all for accepting our invitation and for being able to spend 2 days with us in Doha. And I'd like especially to thank my collaborators, Hani and Mohammed, who have made this conference possible and have organized along with Safa and Kabashi here at the university. I'm very pleased also to acknowledge and to thank Jason McSparran for equally supporting the project at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. And I begin with an apology. I did for once pack a suit, but as is appropriate, it is in my suitcase. And my suitcase is somewhere, I hope, between JFK and Doha airports, as we arrived late from Boston. But I will attempt to be more sartorial tomorrow than today. As some of you know, it's been a very interesting period for me, along with Jane Parpart, kick-starting a new PhD in global governance and human security at the University of Massachusetts. And it's very much informed by this QNRF grant and network, which is very organic and continues to develop in interesting ways. And I think unanticipatedly, this conference is ever more timely, as symbolized by the latest cover of The Economist on sheikhs versus shale, the new economics of oil, and by Monday's stock market shake-up affecting particularly Canada, China, producers and consumers of raw materials, etc. And I think this is very much a wake-up call and an imperative for all of us to continually reflect on our analytic assumptions and our policy directions around development, around diversification, around governance, around varieties of security, varieties of capitalism, etc. In particular, I picked up 2 lessons in the last fortnight as I was completing my class at UMass on global governance. Firstly, I don't know how we all missed it, but in 2009, the OECD produced a very interesting report on the scale of the informal part of the labor sector, claiming that 2/3 of the total of 3 billion workers, mainly of course female, are actually in the informal rather than the formal sector, and what that does in terms of employment, rights, retirement, etc. And secondly, just this year, a very interesting, important, and irrefutable book has appeared on global shell games, focusing on experiential transnational relations. In the very prestigious Cambridge University Press International Relations series that BISA, the British International Studies Association, produces in Cambridge, by Finley, Nielsen, and Sherman on offshore financial centers, money laundering, crime and violence, etc. And in particular, the second one has a very interesting web page on www.globalshellgames.com. So I have certainly been learning, this old dog has been learning new tricks getting to this conference. So I'd like to pass on to my co-organizers to extend their welcome, and then also to welcome Dr. Hatam and Dr. Omar. We're very grateful for their support, both institutional and financial, for this very exciting and timely project. And it's a particular pleasure also to welcome the ambassador from South Africa, who I believe This is one of his final acts as His Excellency the Ambassador, and we're very pleased to catch him before he disappears to the Western Province to spend Christmas and New Year's back in his own country. So welcome to everybody, and my pleasure to now hand over to Mohammed, who's very much our local host and animator here. So thank you, Mohammed.
Sabah al-Khair, good morning. Welcome to Qatar Foundation, Education City, Hamad bin Khalifa University. On behalf of Qatar Faculty of Islamic Studies, Public Policy Program, Hamad bin Khalifa University, I would like to welcome you all. This is Dr. Mohammed Evran Talk, and it is such a fascinating opportunity and honor for us to have you here. And we are honored with your presence and interest to our conference. First of all, I would like to thank you all for making this possible. And I would like to thank my collaborators, Professor Tim Shaw and Professor Heini Besada, for collaborating with me on this very important and exciting project on Qatar-Africa relations. We are thankful to Qatar Nation Research Fund and conference and workshop sponsorship program for their generous support and guidance throughout this process. We are really grateful. And we are confident that our research is contributing and will keep contributing to Qatar's National Vision 2030 and Qatar's development ideals for the future. I would like to extend my gratitude to Professor Hatem El-Karanshawi, who has supported us throughout our journey since when we made our application to Qatar Nation Research Fund for the 6th cycle. Also, my colleagues at Qatar Faculty of Islamic Studies, from the admission to the public relations to various different departments, whose support was vital to make this event a success case. So, welcome to Doha, and as you know, we have translation if you need. We have the full internet service, and if there's any issues regarding logistics or any other thing that you would like us to fulfill, please feel free. We'll do our best to make sure that your experience is a fascinating one in Doha. Thank you.
Good morning, members of the Diplomatic Corps, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. The University of Ottawa, Canada, one of the 3 conference organizers, together with the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and our host, Hamad bin Khalifa University, Qatar Faculty of Islamic Studies, strategic partners on an ambitious and prestigious Qatar National Research Fund grant, which this forum is a product of. It's my great honor and privilege to welcome many of you to this forum, the Qatar Foundation Forum 2014. Titled Investment Governance of Africa's Natural Resources for Economic Diversification and Development. This conference was made possible by a separate conference grant from the Qatar Foundation, which we are very thankful for. I see many familiar faces in this room, both from North America, Africa, and Asia, who have traveled very far to be here, and also local-based representatives, stakeholders we've been in touch with for quite some time now, over the last year and a half. We've been very fortunate to be in the company of many authoritative voices willing to share their insights, expertise, and expansive knowledge on the subject matter of the governance of natural resources in Africa. I believe one of the most compelling policy issues facing the continent today, and it's shaping its future directions. Over the next 2 years, we'll be hearing presentations touching on diverse issues and concerns, ranging from natural resource investments and development in Africa, introducing a Qatari perspective to the role of impact of emerging powers in sub-Saharan Africa, political influence in shaping the policy environment, contributions of the private sector in exploiting Africa's natural resources, risk-return factors for private sector activities, corporate social responsibilities and its effectiveness, community rights reaction, FPIC issues, institutional changes, opportunities in governance of natural resources, and the geopolitical context and influences of social, economic, and security development. This conference will highlight the perspectives of key players, especially those engaged in implementing related to investment and governance of the extractive industry in Africa. The main objectives of the conference: one, to facilitate learning and sharing of knowledge of key thinkers and stakeholders, set a clear agenda for future programmatic action and research that will dovetail and inform our own research at the Qatar National Research Fund grant. And also in terms of exploring specific role for Qatar and its current and future extractive and natural resource landscape in Africa. Qatar being an emerging power, and it's one that looks at Africa for an important investment destination in the near future. The conference will be divided into two distinct proponents. One looks at present current initiatives and progress, and one to present and explore current international thinking on the governance of the extractive industry. Without further ado, I'd like to turn the microphone to Professor Shah, who will be introducing Dr. Hatem. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to welcome the founding dean of the Faculty of Islamic Studies here, and express again our gratitude to him and his colleagues for hosting this very exciting and timely project supported by the Qatar National Research Foundation. So thank you for joining us, sir.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of Allah, most merciful, most graceful, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure and honor to welcome you all to this distinguished conference that represents one of the major initiatives of the Qatar Faculty of Islamic Studies, and allow me to take you through a very brief journey about the concept and the culture of the Qatar Faculty of Islamic Studies and how it is related to the theme or the main themes of our conference today. Qatar Faculty of Islamic Studies was the first postgraduate school to be established in Qatar, as a matter of fact. And it is the first homegrown institution in the education city in Qatar, this distinguished project that represents a pioneering effort to bring together the best possible minds of the world, of the best leading universities, and to interact with the culture, local culture, as well as the regional and the international culture. The idea of the faculty was to be a hub for research, for deliberation, for discussion, and for presenting what's useful to not only to Qatar, but to what's useful to humanity. And probably that brings the question, where is Islamic in all of this? As a matter of fact, we are taught in Islam, and this is one of our basic principles, that we have to seek knowledge wherever it is, and knowledge that's useful to humanity. And it has to be useful teaching, useful learning, useful research is the basic motto. At the first postgraduate school to established here, research department, research centers were central to our efforts. We pioneered a number of areas that we believe that we tried to attract scholars from all over the world to look into it. That represents the interaction of the Islamic faith and the Islamic culture and the Islamic tradition in various aspects of life. Whereas we have what might look like a traditional degree, master's degree in contemporary jurisprudence, we have also a degree in architecture and urban design. We have a degree in the study of contemporary Muslim societies, be it a minority Muslim groups or a majority Muslim countries. We have a degree in comparative religion because we live together, we survive together. Our collaboration with other human beings in different faiths, different belief systems is essential to the survival of humanity and the prosperity of everyone. And this is, after all, the mission of Islam. is to extend its hands to everyone and to be open to the other. We never impose our face on others. Those who try to use this simply are out of the tradition, the culture, or the beliefs of Islam. We present ourselves, but we never impose ourselves. We extend our hands, we engage with the world and don't separate from it. We try to learn from the other in the same way that we try to teach the others what we believe. And we believe this is the only way that we can, all of us, as human beings, flourish, survive, and prosper. This conference that we are hosting today, thanks to the basic collaboration and support from our supporters and hosts in this conference, is a good representation of this. Foreign investment and direct investment is all over the world. It have been there for centuries. And we can talk about the, thank you, the investment in natural resources or the exploitation of natural resources all over the world have been there. I mean, India was the most notable example, and then recently, more recently, Africa. Natural resources are all over the place. Capital, international capital, moves to maximize profit. Now, is it the game to be a zero-sum game? Someone maximizing profits, someone losing its natural resources? Or should we try to find a way where we can have a win-win situation, and if possible, a maximum situation, rather than a trade-off between someone is making gains, someone is making lesser gains, or even losing its natural resources. And once again, this is the approach. If you can try to maximize the benefit for everyone, if we can find a formula that will make the natural resources work for the benefits of those who own it, that were given to them as a gift by God subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the same time by those who have saved, used their capital and their extra funds to try to help themselves and help the others. This is again, once again, this is within the spirit of what we are talking about, of working for the benefit of humanity. In the brief history of the Faculty of Islamic Studies that's extend only for 8 years. We are a young institution. We have tried to practice this mission and vision that we envisage at the very beginning. We extended our arms to have collaboration with learning centers and research centers all over the world. From North America, Canada, and the United States, going to the other end of the East, to China, New Zealand, Australia, throughout Europe and Africa and Asia, and needless to say, in the Middle East and in the Arab world. We extend our hands, and we were very well received by so many institutions who participated. The last international conference that we held here in Doha 2 years ago, we had 130 researchers from more than 30 countries participating. It was about Islamic finance and Islamic economics. We received more than 1,400 papers that we had to select from. Once again, we host in our faculty as a visiting professors from all over the world, be it from our neighboring Arab countries, and once again going through Europe, North America, and we receive missions and delegations to participate in our research efforts, in our deliberation, in our discussions. We open our hearts, our hands, and our premises to help. Africa, for this decade and for the coming decades, as a matter of fact, is a main emphasis for the area and for the region. Africa's potential is tremendous. Whether we are talking natural resources, which is the main theme maybe here, or human resources. or we are talking the potential for presenting new frontiers for the whole world in culture, living together, and in advancement. It's a virgin land, and it has all the beauty and potential, chances, and things to give to the world. And if we can manage together through this first step, which I considered maybe a small step towards the wrong road, to develop, market, and establish a formula of investment policy to utilize these human capital, natural resources, and potential for the benefit of Africa and for the benefit of the world, I think we are going to take a major step on the road toward the prosperity, not only of Africa or Qatar or the region, but towards the prosperity of the world. I think we can present a model for the different parts of the world that can be a leading role. And this is why the importance of this project, why this is the importance of this symposium. Once again, I welcome you all, and I hope that you are going to have very successful deliberations, and you are going to reach the conclusion that you are working for, and I hope you enjoy your stay in Qatar. I welcome you in the name of Qatar Faculty of Islamic Studies, Hamad bin Khalifa University, and Qatar. Welcome to our place, and have a pleasant, fruitful, successful time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hatam. And I think that this puts in context not only the relationship between Qatar, the Gulf, and Africa, but in many ways the connection 8 years of your faculty connected to the Qatar National Research Foundation. Our PhD in global governance and human security is not yet 3 years old, and we're very pleased to be working with Dr. Omar in terms of the further development of the social sciences, both here and elsewhere. I neglected to mention in my own opening remarks that I was particularly pleased that this project was successful in a recent competition that the National Research Foundation organized for the annual research conference, and was particularly impressed by the PowerPoint that Mohammed and his colleagues here in Doha produced on that occasion. So without more ado, Dr. Omar, very glad to meet you and looking forward to helping work with the Qatar National Research Foundation both on this project and the development of social sciences beyond 2015.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين. Dr. Hatem Al-Qaranjawi, founding dean of the Qatar Faculty of Islamic Studies. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, colleagues, Mr. Kabashi. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. Peace be upon you. Good morning, everybody. This is indeed an honor to me to address you this morning for this forum. And please allow me to tell you the picture where we see the QNRF, the Qatar National Research Fund, is located within this overall context of the investment and governance of Africa's resources for economic diversification and development, a forum which we are very happy to sponsor. I'm referring to a report done by the Brookings Institute and has been published in March 2013 within the series of Africa Growth Initiative. They concluded the report with, I quote, "For Africa to achieve transformative progress, policy solution must come from African sources." Let me take you back in the year 2000, where also I refer to the Economist journal that, again, between brackets, they refer to Africa as the hopeless continent. This was based on many disadvantages that characterized the continent: poverty, diseases, cycle of conflicts, military, dictatorships, etc. You know about that. However, in the year 2011, after a decade, the same journal has referred to Africa as the hopeful continent. So in Africa, within a decade, everything changed, and especially in the sub-Saharan region, that has undergone major transformation. So this positive view of Africa is justified indeed. Sub-Saharan Africa is host of some of the fastest growing economics in the world now. The growth is driven by vibrant private sectors, supported by the improved business climate. There have been also dramatic improvement in the governance and economic management. The information technology revolution has become an important aspect of the new Africa, practically the IT sector and mobile technologies. All of these information are extracted from the economists, as you understood. So as a result of that, the middle class in Africa has now grown rapidly, and the continent has become a major market for customer need. Notably, many countries began to engage in Africa. China, Russia, Turkey, United States, Canada. In Qatar here, and as far as we are concerned, in the Qatar National Research Fund, we opted to go or to help in that development from the door of enabling international collaborative research. So what we do here is we fund projects on competitive basis, and we enable international exchange of ideas. As a matter of fact, as of today, we have more than 100 institutions from sub-Saharan African countries who are already collaborating in research projects with local institutions and with international institutions. And we are happy to enable these links in topics, very, very important topics related to energy, water, climate change, and policy making. So our goal is to deliver research from an African perspective that informs sound policy, creating sustained economic growth and development for the people of Africa, the region, and the world. So from this perspective, you understand that this topic, the topic of this forum, is very, very important to the QNRF, and that's why we did not hesitate in sponsoring it. I think personally that this platform is a tool where all the criteria leading to the overall picture of economic development would be linked together, and I'm very sure that the scientific research is one of them, if not one of the most important ones. So without further ado, I wish you all success in this forum, and I'm looking forward to receiving the results and the deliberation of your forum. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Omar. I have myself got myself into some trouble in some parts of Africa in the last couple of years by talking about how Africa is achieving agency rather than being continuously subjected to dependency. But I'm sure that will be part of our subtext here today. I was also very pleased in the last couple of months. My first PhD, Dr. Maria Nzomo, at the University of Nairobi, invited me back as external examiner. And I didn't see very much of Nairobi because I had 35 sets of exams, 125 theses to examine, so I was locked in a hotel room most of the time. But I did escape to go to the iHub in Nairobi, the new emerging Savannah connection in terms of the new technologies. And Kenya has been particularly influential in extending the mobile technologies into finance, M-Pesa, etc. So I think there's some very interesting dimensions that I hope we can discuss as we talk about not only the connections between Africa and the Gulf, but also the connections of the diasporas in both to each other and to development. It's a great pleasure then to invite His Excellency Rasool to talk after his 4.5 years in Washington. I've only endured 2.5 in the United States, so I'm very impressed that you've survived. He comes to us obviously from the diplomatic corps in South Africa, but has a very interesting background in terms of his role in the academy as well as in diplomacy at UCT and UWC in the Cape Town area, particularly focusing on literatures and on histories. And I guess it's true to say, sir, that as you approach premature retirement, and I'm sure you'll do many other things like I will after retirement, you're allowed to perhaps be less diplomatic now than 4.5 years ago. So we welcome your comments.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shaw, and thank you very much, Dean Hatim, for hosting us and for the Islamic faculty to put together an impressive conference like this. Thank you very much, Dr. Hani and Dr. Muhammad, for the work that you've done, and to the Hamad bin Khalifa University for taking an initiative that I think is absolutely crucial at this moment. It was a few years ago, in 2011, that South Africa was invited to add the S to the existing BRIC. And BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, became BRICS with the addition of South Africa. The originator of the acronym BRIC, Jim O'Neill of Goldman Sachs, he wondered aloud and globally and said, "It is not entirely obvious to me why South Africa should be invited to join BRICS. It's not even a big economy. In fact, it is struggling a lot." And in one sense, he was absolutely right. South Africa, with a population of about 50 million people, did not compare to China and India, with populations of over 1 billion people. South Africa, with a GDP of a few hundred billion US dollars, did not compare with the GDPs of other BRIC countries. South Africa, with a growth rate of about 3%, did not compare at that time to the growth rates of countries like China, who was at 8–9%. And so in one sense, Jim O'Neill was absolutely right. But in another sense, he did not understand what was happening, because when South Africa was invited to join BRICS, it was in a sense a down payment. It was in a sense a deposit on the access to the African economic opportunity. Because what BRICS was understanding was that they needed a soft landing into sub-Saharan Africa, which they saw at that point as a treasure trove of commodities and an opportunity that they needed to share in order to fuel the economies and sustain the growth rates and feed the populations that they had to be able to deal with. And the soft landing that they identified into Africa at that point was through South Africa, because what South Africa presented was probably one of the more advanced industrial economies in sub-Saharan Africa. What South Africa represented was a 24/7 banking system that could trade anywhere in the world. What South Africa represented was a globally justiciable legal system that wherever you transact in South Africa, it could be justiciable anywhere else in the world, and the kind of protection that business people required. And what South Africa represented on the African continent was one of the best governed stock exchanges, not only in Africa, but certainly in the world. And so what Brazil, Russia, India, and China did was to establish a deposit on the African continent through South Africa. 2 years later, in 2013, South Africa hosted that year's BRICS conference in Durban. What South Africa did when it hosted it was to invite African heads of states from sub-Saharan Africa to join in and to put on the table what the economic development plans are and the infrastructure development plans are for the African continent, and put it on the table at the level of BRICS. BRICS then realized that more than simply understanding Africa as the destination for the second scramble to Africa, that it may require far more of an exchange between BRICS and the African continent. they were right, that Africa was the second fastest growing region in the world economically after a place like China, that Africa did have 6 of the 10 fastest growing national economies in the world, that indeed 60% of the world's arable land was to be found in Africa, that the highest rate of return on investment anywhere in the world was in Africa, because at that stage, Africa's return on investment was in the order of 8%, the global average was about 3%, and in the United States, I like telling them, the average rate of return is between 1 and 2%. And so, Africa offered these opportunities, but Africa had the bitter experience of the first scramble for Africa. And so, in a sense, how does a continent move, as Professor Shaw says, to agency from dependency? And it was almost a fairly counter-instinctive thing that Africa had to do. It needed to sell its commodities to places like China, India, Brazil, and Russia in order to create liquidity so that it could be able to sort out the fundamentals of the African economy, which was a severe deficit in infrastructure, a 70% poverty simply at the level of energy that prevented Africa industrializing at a scale, and overcoming the distortions of the transport infrastructures, because up till that point, every colonial power that had occupied an African state had simply drawn infrastructure lines from the point of production to the point of export, but nothing that connected the African economies in a fundamental way. And so there was almost the need initially for a Faustian pact, the need to be a source of commodities for these emerging markets, but to use the liquidity in order to redraw the economic development, the infrastructure, the energy, the water provision, and all the other maps that Africa needed to sort out. The question was always going to be, who would prevail? Would Africa be able to get what it wants by selling its commodities on those markets, or would the buyers of those commodities create a dependency on the income and prevent Africa from being able to drive its own agenda? And I think the jury is still out on a matter like that. And coming from the United States, we hope it's not the grand jury. And so that is the conundrum that I think Africa sits with at this moment. Africa understood initially, after the first burst of relationships, particularly with China, Africa understood that it needed to relate to China not simply as national economies, because China would come into a single nation, buy up the rights to a particular set of mines in exchange for building an airport. And so was born the Africa-China Summit, where African countries no longer simply went into bilateral relationships with China, but were able to construct an African multilateral relationship with China and be able to negotiate a lot more the terms of the trade. And so again, I think it's still early days to assess whether that strategy has become successful. I think the 2013 BRICS Summit then brought a completely different dimension, because then Africa was able to negotiate not simply with China, but with BRICS about how to manage Africa's needs by offsetting the commodity needs that BRICS countries had. And so what Africa came out with, the 2013 BRICS Summit, was the commitment to a BRICS development bank that would have a total capitalization eventually of about 250 billion US dollars, largely driven by the infrastructure needs of a continent like Africa. I think the idea of a BRICS Business Council that created private sector linkages between the two, a dedicated think tank that could drive the research agenda between BRICS and Africa, and so forth. So again, I'm saying that these are early initiatives. It's only 1 year on. The first down payments for the BRICS Bank is being put on the table. It's still going to be in the terrain of scrambling for who gets the lion's share of resources and so forth. But I think, again, there's a building block that has been put in place that I think could give Africa a more than even chance of competing and having these relationships with the BRICS countries. I think that what is often missed, because you now have a situation where the former colonial powers, who for a century and then for the last few decades after independence, have by and large done nothing different to what BRICS is now accused of doing. Extracting the resources and the minerals and the commodities of Africa. In the pre-independence days, they treated it as an extension of France, an extension of Britain, an extension of Portugal, and so forth. After independence, the way that they had disengaged from Africa was by still signing over the rights to the mines, the rights to the minerals, the rights to the commodities of Africa. They simply now commercialized what had before been politicized relationships. And so we must have enough salt when we look at the complaints from former colonial powers about China's mercenary approach, for example, to Africa's resources. I think that Africa must be in a position where it has control over its economies, and therefore another countermanding initiative by Africa based on the new plan for Africa's development, or NEPAD's template, is to create regional economic integration and to find ways to prioritize intra-Africa trade, which at this point is only at about 10 to 12% of the total trade of Africa. And we can see the beginnings, if that were to work, we can see the beginnings of success. Because, for example, at this stage, South Africa, under the African Growth and Opportunities Act, is able, for example, to export BMWs. Every 3 Series BMW that drives in the United States of America is manufactured in South Africa. What that car represents is the raw rubber from a country like the DRC. It's the raw leather from a country like Botswana. It's alloys that come from various metals. It gets manufactured in South Africa and then exported. Now that is only a simple tip of the iceberg of what is possible if intra-Africa trade were to be facilitated on the basis of connective infrastructure. Now, connective infrastructure is difficult if you consider that Africa probably has about 3 competing railway gauges that don't speak to each other. The French gauge is this wide, the British gauge is that wide, the Portuguese one is different, and therefore it's not a simple task of making the railways run across Africa if the width of the tracks differ from country to country. So those are the things that would have to be reconceptualized completely on the African continent and constitute both the technological and the infrastructural challenges that the continent must be able to solve. But I also think that other than the former colonial powers now accusing Africa of being the site for further extraction from China and BRICS and so forth, I think there's not always an intelligent reading of what is at stake. South Africa, for example, has a relationship within BRICS, but it relates to BRICS as a set of emerging markets. And so we understand that in a globalized world, we need multipolarity economically, because when national sovereignty and national borders are being eroded, you may have to find alliances and coalitions with other countries which allow you a collectivity to compete at the global level. And so BRICS is an alliance and a coalition of emerging markets in order to strengthen particularly the trading and economic power and bargaining power of a set of emerging markets. But when it comes, for example, to the United Nations, South Africa did not vote, for example, with China and Russia when it came to Resolution 1973 for the no-fly zone in Libya. Instead, the African countries who were temporary members or non-permanent members of the Security Council, they voted in one way. China and Russia voted in another way, which then begins to say that one must not confuse what has been constructed as an economic relationship of emerging markets with a political relationship, because within BRICS there is a political alliance called IPSA, India, Brazil, and South Africa. The characteristic that holds those three countries together is that not only are they emerging markets, they are also emerging democratic powers. They also hold a particular set of values in common politically that drive their agendas. And so I think that what we need to be able to do is to disaggregate the economic from the political, is to be able, in conclusion, to see what is the dialectical battle between Africa and BRICS. That Africa has an immediate need for liquidity in order to overcome its deficits, and may need to feed the need by BRICS countries for commodities to fuel their economies. And I think that what a conference like this has to do is to be able to deliberate on how one can manage, not simply criticize and condemn or be disparaging of it, but how does one short-circuit that relationship between the two so that Africa sooner rather than later is able to determine its path economically, because, and the path economically for Africa has to be to industrialize. It can't industrialize at this moment because it has a 70% energy deficit. Energy has always been the driver of industrialization. And so we need to be able to understand which dominoes we are going to have to fall first. And for me it appears as if the three dominoes that are beckoning is the domino of energy, the domino of connective infrastructure, and then the domino of human resources. And I'm not saying that that's the order, and it would be interesting to hear from the assembled experts who are here how to sequence those dominoes, because in the next few decades Africa will have 50% of the world's population under the age of 35. That could be a blessing because it provides human resources for an aging North and for itself and the world. But it could also be a curse because if not developed, it becomes the next source of pathology for the world. And I think that those are conundrums that I think that we face in our relationship. And I thought that it would be useful for us to be able to create and to project this complexity of the relationship so that we are able to grapple with the key things that I think Africa is struggling with today. I think, finally, that it was probably the greatest acknowledgement that the North has been absent from the game when President Obama in August this year convened the US-Africa Leaders Summit. For the first time, 47 African heads of state came to the USA. For the first time, the USA has had to admit that it was late in the game for Africa and that it had to play catch-up. And I think that for the first time, Africa is in the great position where it is now able to command the best of what both hemispheres have to offer the continent. And I think that an assembled gathering like this needs to be able to give advice that can help guide Africa in the choices that it makes and in the way it exercises its future options. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim. Clearly, you have quite an agenda for being retired. And thank you very much for getting us launched so comprehensively in terms of our discussion. I just wanted to add that obviously some of the interesting indicators would include things like reverse migration now from Spain and Portugal to Brazil, to Latin America, to Angola, to Mozambique. The very interesting connection between Nedbank and Qatar National Bank in EcoBank, which BRIC airlines are in which airline alliance, whether it's Star Alliance, One World, etc. Your dominoes, and certainly, for better or worse, the emerging water, energy, land, food nexus. And those of us who still engage in counting the whole question of the balance between G20, G77, and some would argue G2 or G3, depending on the relationship between FOCAC, the American relationship with Africa, and similar relations, both Turkey, Korea, the Gates Foundation, and the continent. I hope that we can have 15 minutes of open discussion, because clearly a lot has been put on the table. I know some of you know some of us, but the whole point of this discussion is to open up multilateral conversations over the next few days. So can I see a show of 2 or 3 hands to get the conversation started? And we have microphones, I assume, for those who wish to intervene. Could you also please mention your name and institution so the conversation can flow over coffee? Who's going to begin? If I don't see any volunteers, I'll start to nominate. Yes, sir. I'll take 2 or 3 comments, and then the panel can respond. Yes.
My name is Peter Konze. I'm working now for the Humboldt-Viadrina Governance Center for Natural Resources, and I'd been working 35 years before for GIZ, mainly in and on Africa. Ambassador Rasool, this was an extremely interesting overview on the chances of Africa under BRICS. I wonder, there's always one question which comes into my mind. There has been a discussion the last 10 years that Africa has to get away from purely only exporting raw materials. That should be developed more possibilities on the value chain in further working on taking raw materials as a basis, than not exporting as such. I see a little bit the danger in the cooperation with BRICS, mainly with China, that it strengthens again the role of Africa as this raw material exporter only.
Thank you. George, are you going to be next?
Yeah.
From Uganda and Tunis.
Yes, from Uganda and Tunis. I think I have a question for you, Tim, and the ambassador. And my question is linked to the issue of agency, and one thing that has come back with a big bang, which is big infrastructure. In the 70s, I think 50s and 60s and into the 70s, big infrastructure was the thing. and then there was a lot of white elephants around. Now we are talking big infrastructure, big dams, everything has gone back big all of a sudden. I wonder how now we will avoid having white elephants. What is your take on how big infrastructure this time will be different from big infrastructure of the 60s and 70s?
Thank you. And Ms. April? And then I think we'll respond if we may.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. My name is Yazini April from the Human Science Research Council in Pretoria, South Africa. My question is to Ambassador Rasool. I want to say thank you for your presentation. I have two questions. The first one is to do with the corridors, the north-south corridor, the corridor in the north. In regards to what you were saying about the railway lines, what is the status of those corridors? Because that would have helped deal with the infrastructure problems that you are alluding to right now. And then the second question has to do with the BRICS Bank and the one that's supposed to be launched in South Africa, as to whether this can play a role into what the first question was raised, because it's my understanding has to do with infrastructure development, and whether mining would play a role in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you. My quick response would be to encourage us to think through what is infrastructure in 2015, and is it virtual as well as substantial? Is it the internet, M-Pesa, as well as roads, railways, etc.? And secondly, the notion of developmental state, obviously coming out of the NICs and the BRICS, and the concerns by the UN Economic Commission for Africa to advance that, and the prospects of the African mining vision going beyond vision. But I would rather pass the microphone over to Ibrahim. So.
No, thank you very much. I think that the point that Peter makes about whether we confirm Africa as a source of commodities only, I think depends entirely on what we do with the revenue of those commodities. Unfortunately, I think that you may have a cleavage between, say, particularly oil-producing states. For example, where it is a commodity that often encourages the formation of elites rather than the empowerment of communities. It may end up, for example, circulating only the money at the top rather than infusing it through society. And so I think that the challenge for Africa will be, how does it use the revenue that comes from the commodities, whether it puts it into all those definitions of infrastructure. And I think that infrastructure, when I speak about it, I speak about the energy and the water infrastructure that serves human. I think it's about the infrastructure for transport, and it's the electronic infrastructure, and the good signs are there that the fiber optic connectivity is in place and beginning to crisscross the continent. Satellites are being put in place that makes telemedicine and all of those kind of things available, and cellular connectivity is in place that makes your smartphone, your bank, and everything else. So I think that it's really managing the curse of certain minerals and commodities that lead almost too directly to the formation of elites and the circulation of money at those kind of levels only. I think it's a management issue that we need to watch, and that's why I said that the jury's still out on a matter like that. On the second issue that George raises, I think that there may be a qualitative difference between the visions of the 70s for infrastructure and the visions of the 21st century for infrastructure. The 70s was building monuments to particular leaders and so forth. It was a lot more conspicuous consumption. It was trying to fly the flag of development and so forth. Whereas I think under the leadership now of the African Union, we've been able to present to BRICS a disciplined program that is not necessarily national, but transnational in Africa. So it is not simply a country saying, this is what I want to do, but it's a conglomeration of countries that have come together, for example, to say, we want to build Grand Inga as a dam and as a hydroelectric project, and that if Grand Inga comes on stream, we could sort out at least 25% of Africa's energy needs. And it is therefore not national, but more transnational and so forth. So I'm hoping that under more decisive leadership from the African Union, we could cross our chauvinistic borders in conceiving of the infrastructure needs of the continent. I think, for example, the North-South corridor is an example of that, which may start off in South Africa and hopefully ends up in Cairo, and creates, in a sense, the spine of the transport connectivity, and therefore allows for the ribs to come off it and do the kind of east-west connections as well. What's the status of it? I think South Africa has, for example, leveraged its power of procurement over a company like General Electric. It said to General Electric, we need 500 locomotives. The first 100 you can produce in Erie, Pennsylvania. But the other 400 will be built in South Africa. You will set up a plant there, train our capacity, and that will be the base from which you will export further locomotives across Africa. So I think that that General Electric plant, for example, that is now running in South Africa is already preparing the rolling stock for the kind of projects that I think would flow out of the North-South corridor. So that's the emerging status, I think, of it. And then certainly I think that we need to be able to see how much of the BRICS Bank overall amount comes to Africa. And President Zuma has just been in China to try and put the finishing touches on the contract for the location of the BRICS Bank. So that's a work in progress at this moment.
Thank you. We'll just take a couple more questions. Happily, traffic has delayed a couple of our panelists for the next session, and then we'll have coffee. Yes, please.
الو السيد احمد باحث في مركز الهجرة للدراسات بالدوحة. سؤالي اولا اشكر سعادة السفير على هذا التقديم الرائع جدا. عندي سؤال فقط حول علاقات جنوب افريقيا بالعالم العربي بشكل عام وبمنطقة الخليج، خاصة انه موقف جنوب افريقيا من الربيع العربي يختلف من حيث وجهة النظر من موقف دول الخليج ومن موقف العالم، من موقف اغلب الدول العربية، بحيث ان جنوب افريقيا ترى ان ما وقع في ليبيا كان غزوا او كان هجوما من حلف الناتو على بلد افريقي، في حين ان مثلا دول الخليج وخاصة قطر ترى انه فيه انها ثورة للشعب الليبي ضد. هل اثر هذا الاختلاف في الموقف على علاقات جنوب افريقيا بدول الخليج؟ وما هو تصوركم لمستقبل علاقة جنوب افريقيا بالمنطقة العربية بشكل عام؟ شكرا.
And the last question. I don't think we've yet heard from the other gender, so it will be. Oh yes, we have had one, but one final question. In which case, did you get that, Ibrahim?
Unfortunately, I got that question. Look, I think that there's no way that South Africa, given its own history of political struggle against apartheid, its own revolution, the influence of a Nelson Mandela, and so forth, would view the Arab Spring differently than what it views it in a sense today. I think that from our perspective, we have an unshakable faith in democracy, human rights, freedom, the rule of law, and all of those kind of things, and we have advanced it in our in our own country. I think that our major complaint wasn't simply to see Libya as being invaded, but I think that there have been, in our perspective, having voted for Resolution 1973 to create the no-fly zone over Libya to protect civilians, we, I think, were somewhat surprised that NATO provided an air force rather than an air cover. And so we think that much of the instability in the Maghreb and the Sahel comes because of precipitate action, where they did not necessarily secure the arms and the mercenaries and had a knock-on effect in the region. Does that affect the way in which South Africa relates to the Gulf states and to the Arab world and North Africa in particular? I don't think it does. I think we don't see ourselves as being people who dictate democracy. I think we prescribe it, but it has never stopped us from working with people who will find their way towards inclusive and more consultative forms of government. I think that that really is the way in which South Africa has operated. I think we're seeing it in the way in which South Africa is beginning to relate to Egypt, despite where we stood on some of those matters. And so I think that we want to be a democratic, an emerging democratic power, but of a different nature than, say, for example, a prescriptive one that comes from other places. So I think it's something that we will manage, but at the end of the day, I think that it is a way in which we will see how everyone finds their path to it.
This seems like a good time to call for coffee and tea. Let me just thank Dr. Sidi Salam for that intervention. And for those of you who have yet to look at your program, he's a moderator under my DVC from Mbarara, from the Al Jazeera Center for Studies here in Doha. I'd like you to join me in thanking my colleagues, plus Dr. Hatem, Dr. Omar, and Ambassador Rasool for a very interesting beginning, which obviously augurs very well for the rest of the conference. And enjoy the break. But thank you all very much.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We will start our first session today, and it is about natural resources, economic development in Africa from the perspective of Qatar. We will start today with, we have our, here on my right side, Dr. Evan from University of Hamad bin Khalifa. He's an assistant professor in public policy, in Islamic public policy. I have Dr. Abdi Al-Alami on my left hand from Qatar University. And he is an assistant professor in political science and specialized in the African Horn of Africa. Myself, my name is Hassan Yusuf Muhammad from University of Hamad bin Khalifa, and I am in the Public Investment and Islamic Finance Department. We will start today this panel by discussing the prospects and the vision and the relationship of Qatar as a country moving fast with a very ambitious economic development. And we call that program 2030, a big vision. And we see here the relationship as Qatar member of the GCC countries, and look at them as a group, and I look at them in this panel as an entity, has its own interest, own prospect for two different programs for expanding their and diversifying the Qatari economy. So we will start, and we give each one of our participants here 15 minutes presentation, and then we will open for discussion and participation and questions. I would like to start with Dr. Evan.
Still morning. Good morning once again. I presume you have realized there's a couple of changes in the program, so we had to adjust according to some minor last-minute changes. So this means the schedules in your programs, in your sheets, actually is not representing the final updated version, and we apologize for that reason. So what I want to do right now is I would like to discuss a little bit about the research grant itself that I have mentioned earlier today, and my colleagues direct or indirectly referred to. The research grant we have received from Qatar National Research Fund on the 6th cycle, which is a 3-year program, and this is actually a flyer. I don't know how possible to see from there because of resolution, but the title of our National Priority Research Program funding is Governance of Natural Resources in Africa, Advancing a Qatari Perspective and Economic Diversification. Let me try to, I act as the co-lead project investigator for the project, and Professor Tim Shaw is the lead project investigator from University of Massachusetts, and Dr. Heini Besada is acting as the project investigator. But of course, we have wonderful research support from our colleagues. Some of them are currently working, some of them worked with us in the past. Special thanks to them, to Jason, Ben, Ajara, Ahmed, Mu'tasim, Saad, Maisa, Madina, and Aliyo. They have been doing wonderful work, and we are so happy that this research grant has been enabling us to cooperate and create this amazing, vibrant synergy in our work. So this presentation is not a replica, but it's a different version of a presentation I have made a few weeks ago at the ARC 2014, which is Annual Research Conference of Qatar Foundation, which is definitely the most important research event here in Qatar. Most of the been funded by QNRF have the opportunity to present their findings, preliminary findings or final findings in this conference, and I am quite inspired by that presentation, not the replica, but it's a similar version, which will try to introduce you what we have been doing and how we have been doing it. So, if I can start. So the motivation for this research grant actually came from 3 realms. The first realm was Qatar's economic diversification, and Qatar National Vision 2030 clearly makes it straightforward that Qatar is working towards a post-hydrocarbon economy. And of course, there is no one single way to work towards this ambitious goal. And our project fits within the efforts which try to contribute to the Qatar's diversification efforts. And second round, more in depth, how can we analyze Qatar's soft power influence and how it can be used to promote and support economic diversification. And the third motivation for our research is to find out some diagnostic options for Qatari investment opportunities, build up capacities for stakeholders in extractive industry-rich economies in Africa's natural resources, including land and water. Let me try to briefly talk about the phases of research. How did we separate different phases and the analytical focus of research? Phase 1 of research, which we are on the verge of finishing this phase, which was year 1, is to look at Qatar and the Gulf states. and how can we draw some lessons from natural resource governance experiences in the region and as well as in different parts of the world. Phase 2 focuses more on Qatar and Sub-Saharan Africa, energy and non-energy related investments, and the third year looks at the relationship between regionalism and soft to economic power. And these three phases are divided into 6 papers actually that we see as the 6 conceptual papers that we aspire to publish at the end of this research. And the first paper looks at the conceptualization of Qatari Africa foreign policy and economic/business framework. And the objective of this paper is to examine the shifting dimensions of Qatar's mode of engagement with African states, private sector, as well as civil society. How can the concept of soft power help influence and strengthen Qatari business interests and foreign policy objectives in Africa? And this paper will evaluate Qatar's soft power instruments and mechanisms in selected African states. And the second paper, which this is one of the papers we are currently working on, and Professor Besad is focusing on the second one, prospects for advancing Africa-Qatar relations through natural resource investments. And this paper, this sub-phase, look at historical linkages and prospects for increased trade and investments. It will map out the volume of trade investments from the Gulf, particularly Qatar, in Africa's natural resources, including land and water. It will examine some of the bankable opportunities and projects in this area presented to African governments by Qatar. In year 2, the first subsection looks at the potential role of the Gulf, particularly Qatar, in natural resource management and governance in Africa. And this examines to what extent Qatar could advance the implementation of various translational governance initiatives, African Mining Vision, and the Natural Resource Charter, EITI, and more specifically. It will also look at what Qatari lessons, best practices, and knowledge and technical expertise that could be shared with African stakeholders, particularly Qatar's experience in managing natural resource rents and establishing one of the largest sovereign wealth funds globally. The fourth paper is about understanding the nexus between Qatar's food security program and land investments in Africa, a natural resource case study. And this paper will examine the importance of food security in furthering Qatar's development priorities and economic diversification agenda. How do current and proposed investments in Africa's agriculture sector promote one of Qatar's most important national priorities as articulated in the national vision? Paper 5 looks at the contribution of private sector in sustainable broad-based economic development, and this paper tries to bring the African perspective in particular. And it brings an analysis of how economic impact will inform in terms of results such as employment, tax contribution, and local business linkages, whether it's success or failure of governance arrangements for these industries or sectors. The settings vary greatly in Africa from stable to conflict, post-conflict environments, thus conditioning or mediating the potential of the governance setup for resource management. The contribution of the Gulf is crucial to the implementation of locally desired industrial strategies, such as mineral beneficiation. This proposed research speaks to the interest of Qatar's National Vision 2030 in enhancing the role and competitiveness of the private sector in highly competitive globalized environments. And finally, the paper 6 looks at Africa's contribution to Qatar's diversification priorities in the immediate to long term. And it helps evaluate the potential contribution of the continent in furthering one of the Qatar's national priorities, moving away from a reliance on its mining and energy sectors. It will look at what Africa represents in terms of other energy investments, energy or non-energy investments, or sectors for Qatar, and what African state-owned institutions and private sector are doing in this regard. So the last apple that I want to discuss and illustrate is a little bit about the focus, the design, and the primary questions that guide our study. And of course, methodology-wise, which is one of my areas of specialization, there is a lot of things to be said for the project that I cannot share the whole thing. I think we would need another workshop for that. But we had to select countries from a certain analytical focus. And given the diversity of experiences in the continent of Africa, we chose countries, as illustrated in the bubble, based on few criteria. The first criteria was in terms of their whether the fragile conflict states or post-conflict states or stable states. So this analytical focus informed us in terms of how for each category we can approach, we can devise different modalities. And of course, not the only criteria, Qatar's historical linkages with certain African countries, and whether there has been some experience in terms of investment, whether ongoing or in the past, were some other factors that helped us choose the countries, and it was informing our sampling process. What are some of the research questions that lead this project? How does the evolving role of the foreign investors or the private sector in natural resource governance affect peace and stability in the African context? Of course, when I say these are the questions for the project, it's also naturally we are saying that these are the questions that we will be discussing throughout the course of this forum. So what determines, the second question on this linkage, what determines whether foreign investors or private sector plays a positive or negative role? What sort of concrete policy recommendations are available for host governments, foreign investors, private sector actors, and affected communities and international organizations to promote positive developmental outcomes? More specifically, our methodology relies on observation interviews, which can also be differentiated between elite interviews, in-depth interviews, and semi-structured interviews, some surveys, as well as community focus group discussions, which we have started conducting in Sierra Leone, in Ghana, in Ethiopia, and in Chad. So, and this is a photograph of one of our fieldwork that Professor Besada conducted. And also, in addition to this, we had the participatory mapping approach, again, one of specializations of Professor Besada. And this is an illustration of the process that he was conducting in Sierra Leone, if I'm not wrong, in Port Loko, where Professor Besada was engaging with the local community. So these were the apples, but we need to look at the whole tree with its roots and with its branches and everything. So where do we start with when we do the analysis? We start with of course, the reality. What is happening on the ground? What do we observe? What leads? What inspires us? What do we see on the ground is, as our fieldwork illustrates, is deterioration, and and negative impact of certain investments on localities, on nature. And these are some photographs again from Sierra Leone, and an area that is negatively affected by foreign companies' mining practices. So the question is how we can approach this reality from a Qatari perspective, and what are some underlying forces, discussions, and debates. And we can look at the apples, but how can we move from the apples to the whole abstraction, and from that abstraction, how can we go back again to the reality and approach in different ways? This is the idea. And when we look at it, actually, we are really informed by many recent work in the area. And when we bring the Qatari perspective, we are bringing it by situating, by contextualizing it with reference to some emerging concepts, such as global rebalancing. And these books actually are, I don't know to what extent they are readable, but some of them have been edited by Professor Tim Shaw's efforts in different top-notch publications, global publishing houses. So global rebalancing and the emergence of Gulf countries, in addition to BRICS and other powers, is an important factor that we need to understand carefully. And of course, the concept of resource diplomacy. China's example is one of the areas that Qatar has to investigate and understand very carefully. And from that experience, how can Qatar build on its small state diplomacy? And a recent book by Andrew Cooper and Professor Shaw illustrated the vulnerabilities and resilience between the diplomacies of small states and how they can be utilized in emerging markets. And more specifically, Behram Kamrawa recently published a book on Qatar, Qatar entitled "Small State Big Politics," and he tried to explain how Qatar's small state diplomacy could function, and whether it's sustainable or whether it is soft power or it's a subtle power. And along with that, there has been other efforts in the literature that have been investigating Qatar's political economy in various angles, which contribute definitely and inform our research. So from this, what are some preliminary findings? There is room for optimism, as some of our colleagues mentioned, and Professor Tim Shaw make them really explicit when he talks about, in his recent publications, innovations in transnational governance, such as EITI, or innovations such as Maputo Corridor, or free trade agreements, trilateral, or importance of diasporas and remittances, and gangs and guns. This is the typology he's using. And in general, we have to understand and investigate further the varieties of transnational governance opportunities, varieties of regionalisms, and varieties of innovative sources of finance in order to bring the Qatari perspective in its fullest sense. And this is one of the recent reports by Revenue Watch, and this illustrates, this is a comparison of countries in terms of their resource governance index, and there are 58 countries in this index, and Qatar is not doing well. If I'm not wrong, Qatar is 54 out of 50, ranks 54 out of 58 countries. And of course, it has multiple criteria for measuring, but I will not go in depth. I'm pretty sure you're all familiar with this report. But the area that Qatar is doing really well when compared to the other areas is enabling environment. So how can Qatar's enabling environment be the area that we can cultivate? That's the area, and we want to investigate. And that is why we are here today for this conference, and I now pass the stage to my next colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Erwin, for this nice presentation and introduction of the project, which is the investment and governance of African resources for economic development and diversification. We appreciate the introduction, but we will leave the question after the second presenter. And we will look then for an open discussion, and we try to see the tree, how it's going to be fruitful, and the apple are going to be healthy for a good fruition of the relationship between the Gulf states and Africa, and particular emphasis to Qatar role. So I give now the chance for Professor Abdi.
Well, thank you very much. And I wanted to take a minute and say thank you to the organizers of the conference. But before I start, I just wanted to say a few things simply because I happen to be just jumping in and trying to present a broader topic which might be of not so interest to the audience in particular. I'm interested, I'll be talking about the emerging interests of the Gulf states towards the Horn of Africa. This is more general than the specific investment development focus that that perhaps you expected, and we apologize for that. That said, I will now start my discussion, or at least my paper. And there are, as you can imagine, Qatar is one of the 6 Gulf states that are interested in Africa. The drivers of these emerging interests include security, politics, economics, and humanitarian. These are the 4 major components that drive the interests of these Gulf states towards the Horn of Africa. And also, the Horn of Africa is, not just one country. As you know, there are about, depending on how you read, 5 or 6 countries. If you include Sudan all the way, then we have at least 5, if not more. And all of them are interested and linked to the Gulf countries. And these mutual relationships have been going on for quite a while because of the geographic proximity and the cultural affinity of these 2 peoples in this part of the world. With the introductory remarks, I wanted to say a few things about the drivers, the main drivers, and I'll emphasize the economics and particularly Qatar, given the limitations of the presentation. Recently, I think as just about a month ago, Gulf Business ran an article on investment spree in Africa by the GCC countries. And there were investments from Qatar, from UAE, from Saudi Arabia that were very much interested in the area of natural resources, agriculture sector in particular, in Ethiopia, in Kenya, and actually for now, the other 3 countries, maybe to some extent Eritrea, but Somalia and Djibouti are still, not ready for that. So that's one thing that is quite obvious, and Qatar is no exception, even though UAE and Saudi Arabia were more or less in the forefront in this area. So agricultural sector development is, and this is, by the way, informed by the need for food security policy that many African countries are engaged in, and also many Gulf States countries. So this is one aspect of it. But there is strategic importance as well, economically, because these Gulf States, and Qatar being part of it, are oil exporters, and they export oil to Europe, to North America, and to do so they need the Indian Ocean and the Gulf of Aden and all of these, Arabian Sea in particular. All of these require the safety and the security of the maritime areas in this part of Africa, and this makes Horn of Africa very important for the GCC countries and for Qatar in particular. We have to remember that at one given time, Somali pirates hijacked a Saudi tanker that was carrying $100 million worth of crude oil to the North Americas, and that had a significant impact in the interests of the GCC in intervening and contributing to the counter-piracy efforts. And this is, by the way, one can say that it's an economic-driven issue, simply because if the road is not safe, you cannot take your products to the markets that you want to access. And that makes Africa, and particularly Horn of Africa, attractive and important for the GCC countries. Qatar, particularly with its natural gas exportation, is also very much interested in this. Another very important thing that we need to keep in mind is that overall piracy, and particularly the Somali pirates in the Horn of Africa, pose threat to, other, how do I put it, when the World Bank came up with the consequences of piracy, there was a 7% trade loss for the MENA countries, including the GCC, which meant that because of the phenomena of piracy, these economies were losing a significant portion of the gains that they would otherwise access. So that's another very important element to keep in mind. As a result, and particularly in response to these challenges, 4 of the Gulf states, including Qatar, are members of contact group of piracy, and they are also members of the Djibouti Code of Conduct, and a number of other international efforts to reduce piracy and make maritime areas safe and secure, mostly for economic purposes, I would argue. Second, the Horn of Africa itself is an untapped market, not only for investment opportunities, but also they can export to it. And as you know, the GCC, and particularly in UAE and Saudi Arabia and Qatar, they are also sending some goods and exports to these regions. More importantly, Horn of Africa is the gateway to other markets, not necessarily. We have like about close to 200 million if you just put together the 5 countries in that part. But not only those 200 million, there are about, in Central Africa and the other East African countries, if you add together, this is a very important gateway to, other markets. So Africa, Horn of Africa in particular, is crucial strategically for Qatar and for Gulf nations. Besides the economic and security drivers, there are others. As you know, Qatar is quite active in the area of peacemaking. Qatar has mediated Sudanese groups, and Qatar has also sent some peacekeepers in Eritrea, Djibouti, and mediated the conflict there. It had an interest in mediating both Eritrea and Ethiopia, and also Somali conflict. So Qatar's peace activism is quite prevalent in this part of the world, and as such, in particular in Horn of Africa. Finally, most of the Gulf states are active in the area of humanitarian intervention. A number of GCC, at least GCC-based NGOs are based in this part of the world. We have Qatar Red Crescent, Qatar Charity, a number of others that are quite active in this part, in the Horn of Africa. And they do contribute to the development, even though not necessarily to the economic development. One thing we need to keep in mind is that I think Celatec has had some, particularly from Qatar. Celatec is an NGO here that is actively involved in developing microfinances and development opportunities for people who are in need in some parts of Africa. I know that there was, at least some Somali companies like the Habshil and Kah and others from the National Refugee Committee of the United States and Celatec were involved in collaboration of development projects in the Horn of Africa. So when we look things from development perspective, whether it's pure economically and business-wise profitable, or whether it is development in the area of politics, in the area of governance, in the area of humanitarian intervention, in the area of education, Gulf states in general and Qatar in particular are active and present. That does not mean that it's where it's supposed to reach. I think it's a good beginning, and hopefully this will be developing as we look. I have to also admit that this is an area of research that is lacking that focus, or at least the interest of many academics and international organizations. So perhaps this is, again, if anything, what I can point out to is the need to research for these areas that I just pointed out. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Alani for the presentation on the emerging interest of the Gulf state on the Horn of Africa. I would like to throw some points and then we will open for discussion. If we look nowadays, we see a tremendous interest in Africa. If we look from the perspective of the old North-South relationship, and we look at foreign direct investment, we can look what were the interests and what were the gains from transnational and multinational corporations. Now the situation has changed. If we look at this situation from the perspective of East-South and South-South relationship, what are the new factors that affecting the interest? What are the agenda of those investors? Let me put them between two brackets, the BRICS countries and the GCC countries. They are emerging new force and the developing relationship South-South, East-South relationship. And we see Africa as a potential. We call it a diversion land from all perspectives. And now we look at this relationship of the new players in international foreign direct investment. If we look at the GCC, they have a limited resources in agriculture. One of their major aim is focusing on food security. Other aim, what they do is tremendous surplus of sovereign fund states. If I can give a guess, a small guess, I can say approximately, it is over $2 trillion. So huge amount of capital looking for investment opportunities. If you put yourself in the perspective of investor, always you look what are the gains, what are the risks. But if you look on the other side of the host countries, and particularly I'm talking about Africa, they need the know-how, they need the technology, they need the capital to develop their economy, which is lagging behind for years and years and decades. How they can improve? African countries has to come up with the new strategies, new economic development policies, and they should look at it from the perspective of good governance. Because investment, in essence, has to trickle down to those who is really living in the periphery and those who need to improve their income per capita. They want education, they want health services, they want jobs. If now we can say the opportunity is there and this relationship has a momentum to gain for two sides benefiting from this type of relationship. I would like to throw these points, if we look from this, just from the perspective of the GCC, not from the BRICS country, they are more interested for the proximity, a geographical proximity of Africa to the Gulf states. And they are opportunities for this investment and good returns. But we have to think about what is the government of African states, their policy for eliminating the risk. Risk is not just a financial risk. It's a political risk, corruption. No clear laws, regulations to protect the foreign investors. How do you envision this type of marriage between the GCC as potential investors in Africa, and what is the role of African states to attract and to give a good heaven for a fruitful relationship of good marriage of the two sides. Now, I will open the floor for discussion and your participation. Yes, at the back. Could you introduce yourself first. And questions.
Good morning. My name is Tembisa Fakude. I'm from Al Jazeera Center for Studies. Can you hear me? Yes. My name is Tembisa from Al Jazeera Center for Studies. My comment is based on your first presentation about the research fund. I think it's a great initiative, and I noticed that you alluded to the different countries in Africa and how they should be treated. I'd just like to emphasize that point, that it's important for us not to view Africa as homogeneous or as a country. There is that trapping in most countries when they afford or put forward development to Africa, that they treat Africa as a country, but Africa consists of different countries, and the straitjacket approach in dealing with Africa is a problem. But most importantly, it kind of short-changes those countries that have made important strides economically and politically in Africa. So I think we have to take that into consideration as we move forward, that Africa is not a country. Africa consists of different countries, and those different countries deserve and have to be treated in a different way because of their political and development levels. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir. We do believe that there are different countries in Africa. We believe they have different factor endowments and different resources. We do believe the African countries have different regime types and government and political apparatus and different regime types. And thank you. This is a good point to take it in consideration instead of just aggregating all Africa as one country. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yes, good morning. My name is Brian Land from the World Bank. I'm an extractives industries specialist. I wanted to ask a question of Dr. Mohammed Evren Tok, because I think in presenting the research program and its motivation, the point that was made, which struck me as very interesting, is the idea that Qatar needs to be thinking about a post-hydrocarbon age. And I think that every country should be thinking about post-natural resources age, because we know that these resources are finite and they will be depleted. Qatar is in an interesting position of having a very substantial gas resource, certainly enough to be thinking in terms of more than a single generation, but multiple generations. So my question is whether Qatar has articulated a depletion policy or depletion strategy given the resource endowment, and how does that inform economic policy? The reason I'm asking the question is because this could be very relevant for countries in Africa, particularly those that have made very substantial discoveries. Mozambique, for example, given their very substantial gas discoveries, what lessons might there be to learn from Qatar in terms of depletion policy? I hope my question is clear and it be possible to respond to it. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone
No, thank you very much for the two questions. Just to respond to the colleague from Al Jazeera, we actually have 17 countries that we're looking at on the continent, country case studies. This is informed by Qatar's interest in those countries. It's also informed by the geopolitical and security dimensions, as well as the importance of natural resources in those economies. So rightly so, this is something that we've taken into consideration in terms of how we chose those countries. We go very deep in terms of the local dynamics and looking at regional factors that impact governance of natural resources, working closely with local partners, whether it's NGOs, civil society, private sector, governments, and multinational corporations. This is part of the field research that we've conducted so far in the 4 countries we have outlined. So your point is well taken. Just to answer my colleague from the World Bank, Brian, what we have found out in terms of our engagement with Qatari officials is that they understand the need to diversify and promotion of diversification process within their national priorities, and that's what's outlined in the National Vision 2030 and the Qatar National Development Program 2011 to 2016. In our engagement with Qatari officials from Qatar Mining, Qatar Energy, Foreign Ministry, they see Africa as an important investment destination. The problem here lies is their inability to understand the local dynamics, which would impact in terms of how Qatar's role would be and what impact would their interventions be. And this is something we are trying to work with them on in terms of informing them what is the landscape and what is the role of Qatar's opportunities and that presents itself for Qatar to play a positive role in the management of natural resources, but also in terms of looking at Africa as an important investment destination that speaks to their interest in promoting diversification. What we have looked at in East Africa with investments in Ethiopia and what have you is Qatar has an immediate interest also in terms of food security, which is something that is of importance to the Qatar and informs Qatar foreign policy objectives. Again, the problem lies is their problem to understand the local dynamics that impact local administration of natural resources in Ethiopia, for example, when it comes to land. So the first year of our work is really trying to inform the Qatari officials and what is the intersection of Qatar's interest in Africa. Obviously, Qatar is an important and emerging partner in development. It sees itself as a development partner without all the colonial baggage that goes with traditional investments that have gone into Africa. But it doesn't still understand their interventions in Africa and how it can contribute meaningfully. That also speaks to Qatar's National Vision 2030 and Qatar National Development Program. Obviously, also the understanding of Qatar's diversification process is one that's closely linked with the need to look at other sources of investment, and that's we talked about Qatar's investments in mining, and there is an increasing amount of investments that are going in North Africa, West Africa by Qatar. They're also looking, as I pointed out, in terms of investments in agriculture. So it's still a work in progress, and it's still informing Qatar's policies with respect to Africa, particularly in natural resources. It's a growing field, and it's something that we hope to continue to contribute to and inform the Qatari officials on.
Just in addition to Their Haine's comment, of course we recognize that every country has its own peculiarities and different experiences, but we also need to have typologies or different sets of analytical lens. And we need these in order to diagnose the similarities and differences, which is, I think, quite intuitive to understand them, and especially important for policy learning, and what are some common challenges, common problems, common struggles, to diagnose and work on them. And this is especially important when it comes to aligning interests and moving forward.
السلام عليكم، رامي ودودي رجل أعمال. سؤالي هو: هل تم تطوير استراتيجيات لإدارة مخاطر الاستثمار في إفريقيا في ظل الظروف السياسية الغير مستقرة وفي ظل عدم وجود قوانين تحمي المستثمر؟ وشكرا.
The question is about what are the risk elements for the investors and what are the rules and policies from the side of the recipient countries or the host countries?
Well, at the moment, there were a number of problems that emerged when some GCC countries started to invest, simply because the governance structures, what on the African side in particular, the partnership is the biggest problem. I remember reading that when some GCC countries tried to invest the port management in Djibouti or other areas, they had serious problems because things were changing at the government, because the legislations, the overall, predictability that is required is not there. So yes, the risk is high, but as they say, the higher the risk, the return is high as well. So there were times when some of the, in Nigeria and in other parts of the Africa, some GCC countries invested in, and they really were saying good things. I haven't seen the figures in terms of what they have profited, but at least the coverage was saying that it was mutually beneficial.
I'd just like to add one point here. Most of the GCC countries' investment in Africa, it takes a form of public sector to public sector. Mainly, if you compare it with a private sector in the Gulf states, it's less or not that significant compared to this. I can call it like bilateral type of investment, state to state, with the guarantee. But your question, how to eliminate the risk element, that is a good question. So that's what I try to say, that African states, they have to create that type of assurance based on good governance to make, eliminate all these type of risk elements, not the investment particularly, but you trickle down all the process of the investment.
Thank you very much for this very important note. Actually, this goes to the heart of what Qatar sees as the challenges of doing business in Africa. And in terms of my interaction with Qatari officials, they've told me publicly, and in visiting various countries and talking to the Qatar embassy officials, trade commissioners, is that it's very difficult to do business in Africa. There's no guarantees in terms of our investments. Governments change all the time. Laws are very opaque, and it's not transparent. The issue also here is that Qatar does business on a government-to-government basis. It does not really interact much in terms of the private sector or civil society agents. So when a government changes, then it has some serious difficulties to continue doing business with that country as a result. And we've seen that in terms of changes in Sudan or in Ethiopia, where they have complained in terms of the lack of accountability and problems in terms of meeting obligations that are intertwined in various bilateral agreements that have been signed between Qatar and those countries. They have not been fulfilled or have stalled as a result of governments changing. Also, we've seen in countries like in Sudan where Qatari investments have gone in terms of agricultural production. There is some serious difficulties in the sense that government priorities have changed in Sudan, and this has implications on Qatar. This is the sort of issues that the Qatari officials complain about. How do we do business? We don't understand the social dynamics that keep on changing, and it's difficult for us to make clarity of it. So this is what I keep on talking about when I meet with African stakeholders, and I do point out this is the challenges that for Qatar to do business in Africa, they need more surety and more guarantees. And this is how Qatar does business in other more stable environments, if I can say this, more mature environments in Europe and North America. But it wants to have those same guarantees and also in Africa. So this is the challenge for Africa in terms of promoting itself as an investment destination to Qatar. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to commend the presentation done by Dr. Mohammed Ibrahim, and also the contribution of all the podium and panelists. My question is, as I have seen the comprehensive and the very informative presentation about the vision of Qatar towards investment in Africa, it looks to me it's like of bilateral, the main aspect is bilateral cooperation in key area of agro-industry and mineral resources. I would like to ask, is there any potential that this relation could be grow up to be cover regional level or continental level? As you know, Africa has 8 regional economic communities identified by African Union Commission. Thank you very much.
And that is one of the intentions of this research, to kind of diagnose or to point out those opportunities that could be utilized on a broader scale. That is why I highlighted, I mean, in research, of course, the research, the end product of our project, translational initiatives. We believe that Qatar, yes, most of the investments or diplomatic relations are taking place on a bilateral level, but why not Qatar articulate herself on extranational or supranational initiatives or translational initiatives that might have less risk and more influence. So that is one of the areas of this research that intends to inform policymakers, decision makers in Qatar that bilateralism may have certain difficulties, but there are some other opportunities. And of course, we have to think in a broader term here, because when you think of Qatari investment in Africa, you are not only talking about Hassad food buying land in Ethiopia or Sudan, but also there's many Qatari entrepreneurs either located in Qatar or in UK, in London. I met some of them that are doing their investments on a private basis. So the impact is higher than we think, and we can conceptualize right now. But what needs to be done is to approach this reality from a broader perspective, and not only from a, as Professor Hassan mentioned, beyond the national frontiers, by looking at different scales of action that integrates, that includes different actors and stakeholders.
سؤالي للجميع للسادة، أولا أشكر الأساتذة. بسم الله. أولا أشكر المحاضرين الثلاثة على، أو المحاضرين الاثنين، الأخ محمد والأخ فياري، على عرضهما الشامل لما يتعلق بسياسة قطر في إفريقيا. عندي فقط ملاحظة، هو أن لماذا لا يمكن لدول الخليج وخصوصا قطر أن تستفيد من تجربة القذافي؟ عفوا، القذافي قد لا يكون ناجح في الناحية السياسية في بلده، ولكنه كان ناجح في الناحية التنموية في إفريقيا، على أساس أن في مركز شراء الدراسات كتبنا بعض التقارير عن الدور التنموي الليبي في إفريقيا، اللي كان دور ناجح، وكان يهتم بعدة قطاعات، خاصة قطاع الاتصال، القطاع المالي، قطاع السياحة إلى آخره. وهي تجربة كانت لها دور أساسي في ربط في تنمية كثير من الدول الإفريقية. سؤالي، هل هذه التجربة ليست صالحة لأن يعني يؤخذ منها بعض الدروس، خاصة في التعامل بين الدول العربية والدول الإفريقية؟ شكرا.
Thank you very much. Professor Bisada, you make a very interesting comment about how Qatar finds it easier to invest in the West, you know, like in the UK, versus in a country like South Sudan, because of the governance and leadership there, which is, in all frankness, any investor would think twice about investing in certain countries in Africa, which goes to what he was saying earlier, that you really have to go also by I think it's a twofold, look at the Qatar government should consider just focusing on the AU, because they do have a regional platform. And then secondly, you cannot avoid the case by case, because there are countries in Africa that are doing well, like Rwanda. You know, there are countries there's this theory of Africa rising, and everybody, in fact, including Qatar, does want that piece of that Africa that's rising. So I'm just wondering if you would juxtapose this view, which you're saying that they feel more assured with the UK, when the fact of the matter is, in this decade, it's now on that continent where business, despite its challenges in some areas, it's the place to basically be. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I just want to put a word of caution here. Certainly the business climate and the business environment is a very important issue. But the fact also remains that there are many countries, the Turks, the Chinese, the Indians, the Brazilians, the Malaysians, they are all there facing the same environment. Why are they there? The question would be, what can we learn? How are these countries navigating the same similar difficult environment, rather than to have, paint a brush, the business environment is very bad. So I think we need to be very careful. What are the lessons we can learn? Because there are countries in droves coming into Africa, facing the same constraint as Qatari or Gulf investors will face. The question is, how are they navigating? What are the lessons they learn? And secondly, there are also a number of other countries where the legal regulatory environment are significantly being improved. So I think that we need to be a little bit balanced. What can we learn? There are difficult circumstances, there's no question about that. But the trend is toward improvement. Maybe one has to be very selective in the number of African countries one has to invest. But I think the climate issue, other investors are coming in under the same political, legal environment, and they are staying, they are investing, they are improvising, they are changing. So we need to have some kind of perspective in this as we talk about the possibilities in Africa.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks. I just have an empirical question. If I recall from the slides from Dr. Talk and the case studies, most of them, if not all of them, were sub-Saharan African countries. And I was wondering if Qatar has a history with North African countries, with Egypt, with Algeria and Morocco, and if that, if that's coming into fruition in both in terms of how they understand the opportunities in sub-Saharan Africa, or are you also looking at North Africa? I know you're looking at the continental level through the AU, etc., but just that question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Abdi Yasin. I'm from Ethiopian Embassy. I just want to react. Regarding taking risk to some extent or not, and with specific mention of Ethiopia. Doctor mentioned that people do not want to take risk because there are changes in investment policies. This is right. For instance, when it comes to the case of Ethiopia, the centerpiece of our foreign policy is economic diplomacy. Therefore, based on the information that we get from investors, definitely we keep on. I mean, this is the third time that we changed the investment policy, but mainly based on the interest of the investors and to accommodate more investment. But here, the point I want to make is the investor is guaranteed, even in our constitution, whether there is a change of government or no government, he is guaranteed. And we are also a member of the multilateral MIGA. So what I'm saying is, what I want to say is, if China is investing, if Saudi Arabia is investing, if Turkey is investing with industrial areas, why can't we have this kind of long-term vision? I mean, I know they have, but I think the Qatari side have to work more on engaging Africa. Thank you.
Thank you to all the speakers. It seems to me that there are three major category investors who might have an interest, who are already or who might potentially invest in African resources. That's QPI, Hassad Food, and Qatar Mining. And I wonder, so far in this research, what have you found out in terms of their existing frameworks for assessing opportunities in Africa and their attitude to governance issues? Is there any existing thinking on that? Is there any conceptual framework? Does it differ between those three investors at all? That's a very large question, but any insight into that would be interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I will just be very brief and select whichever that just fits to my talk. With respect to the North versus Sub-Saharan Africa, I think one point that we need to, at least be aware of is that ministries of foreign affairs in this part of the world are organized along like Arab affairs, African affairs, and there are some countries that would be under the Arab section rather than the African section. So chances are that even countries like Somalia and Sudan might be classified under the Arab affairs, even though they are part of the sub-Saharan Africa. So the organizational aspect of it, because these countries are members of the Arab League as well, and that might have some complications when it comes to, you know, classifying a country, whether it is in the sub-Saharan Africa or not. So there is another identity at play. Second, how do others navigate? China, for instance, and Turkey and others are involved in investing Africa. Well, I guess this is a big challenge to the Western development, but at least, or Western investors, IMF, World Bank, where some conditionalities used to be at least forced open some of the countries. And I remember a case in Angola where IMF was at least demanding some form of conditionalities, and China stepped in and invested about $2 billion, and Angola just walked away from IMF and World Bank. So in this case, the so-called no strings attached, where would the goal, where would the GCC fit? Is it on the China side or on the Western side, or it's just no different? I think that's an area that needs to be looked at. I guess one thing that I wanted to say about the post-natural resource age that one of the commentaries mentioned. In Africa, all talk is about how to exploit natural resources, at least in the sub-Saharan Africa. I don't think they are at the stage where they can talk about post-natural resource age. I know, particularly in the Horn of Africa, they're not even taking advantage of their own natural resources, let alone others. So I would just stop there. Thank you.
Just a quick answer to the question about the empirical part by Professor Blair Rutherford. No, we are not really looking at North Africa. We are only focusing on sub-Saharan Africa. And this was also a kind of methodological choice for us to kind of, because of the limitations of research and time and personnel and different issues, we only focus on sub-Saharan Africa and limited countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Just the other question about the actors and and stakeholders in Qatar, whether there is actually a framework that we have diagnosed so far. This is one of the intended objectives of this research, to understand, is there a framework or any opportunity for a framework? There is no answer to this question right now, but we have conducted more than 40 interviews in Qatar and with different stakeholders. And the three investors you mentioned, Hassad Food, Qatar Investment Authority, and Qatar Mining you mentioned, I guess, both Hassad Food and Qatar Mining are subsidiaries of Qatar Investment Authority. And Qatar Mining so far is acting like a private company, and it's very limited in terms of its action. And they're mostly focusing on gold. And but there are other players. For instance, think of Qatari DR, which is doing mostly real estate investments and hotels in different parts of Africa, and both in North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. Qatar National Bank definitely has been investing. Qatar First Bank, and you can reach different actors having different interests in Africa, but in terms of finding an overarching framework, so far we haven't, but this is one of, as I said, one of the intended objectives of this research. Also, we are so much focusing on investments, but we should also remember that Qatar has a long-standing experience in hydrocarbon industry, and one of the intentions of this research is to showcase if there is any possibility for African countries such as Angola or Nigeria, which are high in oil and gas, to learn from the Qatari experience. So it's not only a matter of investment, but also sharing of expertise that has been accumulated in the past years. So.
Thank you, Blair and Yazini, for your questions in terms of risks. And this is something that we wanted to point out in our research, that you cannot paint the continent with one brush, and there is risk, but there's also ample evidence that there's a lot of good governance that are also taking place. There's a lot of positive stories coming out of the continent, and in terms of how other foreign investors are conducting their business in parts of Africa, the sort of lessons shared and experiences is what we are reflecting on and sharing with the Qatari officials in terms of what to do and what not to do and how do you navigate. And in terms of my engagement with, for example, the Ghanaian government, when I was in Ghana earlier this year and I was talking to them, touching on Evan's point, there is a lot of opportunities in Ghana. Ghana presents itself as a stable market, and it does need a diversification of investors, but also it needs countries like Qatar that has managed natural resources very well. It has, we would say that Qatar has a lot to offer also, and not just in terms of investment, but also best practices when it comes to the hydrocarbon sector. And this is important when you look at the new players, countries that are exploring oil and gas in parts of East Africa and in West Africa. We talk about Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, we talk about Sierra Leone, Guinea. They're all looking at other emerging powers, and in terms of best practices, they're looking at countries like Norway that have done well in terms of managing natural resources, and moving away from reliance on one sort of investor. So in terms of the research work and sharing our experiences and findings about also what other investors are doing on the continent, this is what I think the Qatari officials are starting to realize, that there's a lot of positive stories and there's other ways of doing business and engaging on the continent as equal partners, as a development partner, not as a colonial partner in that sense. Also to touch on what Qatar can do differently, I think one also looks at the importance of the GCC states as a regional bloc, and Qatar using that platform to penetrate and promote its agenda and also its development priorities into Africa. This is one way of leveling and dealing with risks as well. And in terms of our discussions with African stakeholders and governments, they would like to see not just Qatar coming in, but also the GCC as a regional economic bloc, because it does also provide ample investments, opportunities, capital and technical expertise, not just from Qatar, but also from other players in the region. UAE, for example, is much more advanced in terms of its investment footprint in Africa, and this is something that Qatar and other countries would like to look at in terms of the experiences of countries like UAE in using the GCC country platform in terms of promoting increased investment and trade with Africa. So that's is very important in that respect. The question about, just to add to what Evan had indicated about North Africa, initially we had 3 countries in North Africa. That was prior to the Arab revolutions, and we had to revise, although we are still keeping Mauritania as one, because it's a very important country for Qatar. It has investments in Mauritania. But it is difficult when Qatar priorities also in North Africa is changing rapidly. Its relationship with Egypt used to be a very important relationship. It has soured over the years. Libya is also quite unstable for Qatar to continue to do business in Libya. So there is changing dynamics in the North African region, which makes it very difficult to do field research. So, but that's not to say that we'll continue to look at North Africa also as an important area for Qatar, and in terms of Mauritania's opportunities for Qatar, we'll continue to look at that. So I think those are the questions that have not been answered. Thank you.
before we conclude this morning session, we really, the research project is focusing of understanding all the intricacies about these investment opportunities. But if we take Qatar as an entity here out of the GCC, there are different parastatals in Qatar. They are investing in Europe, in Asia, in Australia, in Africa, even in Latin America, in Brazil, in different forms of investment, because they are looking for investment opportunities. Again, answering the first question there about the risk element, always investment has a risk element. So we have mentioned also the bulk of this investment, even in North Africa and the other Arab countries, it is based by government. But there is a role here we can identify of the Islamic banking also are investing in Africa and in North Africa, if we call it. So is there any common policy as a bloc of the Gulf state towards foreign investment and trade? I don't think there is a common objective or strategy jointly. So each country is acting according to their agenda. And therefore, we have different interests from the GCC countries here in the Gulf here, as well as they look at the opportunities of different African countries where there are investment opportunities for business and trade. I conclude here our session this morning, and we will have the lunch break. And thank you very much for attending this session. Thank you.